Welcome to Techer Live. I'm Pat Morrison, a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and we're here at the Einstein Papers Project. So I'm your host for today, but our host here at the Einstein Papers Project at Caltech is Diana Kormos-Buchwald, the Robert Abbey Professor of History here and Director and General Editor of the Einstein Papers Project. You've known this man for about 25 years, so I would call you the Einstein Whisperer. But in fact, this is a man who is legendary, and a lot of people know him in a lot of different ways.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Pat. I am humbled and honored to be speaking with you. You are the voice of Los Angeles, instantly recognizable. You have interviewed many high-profile figures, from Henry Kissinger to Diane Keaton, Salman Rushdie, and many, many more. But you haven't interviewed Einstein. So if he were here now, what would you want to ask him?
We're going to channel some of those questions, exactly. But I think when you said high profile,
Yes.
he comes to mind. People, you ask someone to name a scientist, I would say 90% of the people would name
Yes.
Einstein. They may know Galileo if they read Dan Brown books. They may know Stephen Hawking from watching Big Bang Theory. But Einstein, his physical appearance as well as his name have become iconic beyond any other scientist, I think, at least in modern history. And so we're going to be talking a little about celebrity
Yes.
and Einstein, about how his experience in his life, 30s, 40s, 50s, his time here at Caltech, parallels what's going on now with public reaction to assault on science, with the nature of celebrity, and politics and science. And you know a great deal about that because of all the time you have spent with Einstein. I mean, he's been at your elbow here in this house for quite a long while, so thank you for that. The idea of a scientist transcending mere science is something I think that captivates people, and how the regard of science has changed over the years has been very important. So let's first talk about how he came to Caltech, and then we'll get to the idea of his celebrity, because California is the place that makes celebrities.
Yes. It's a very interesting question. As you once said, you can describe half a millennium in one paragraph, and you can write 10 pages about 1 second. In the case of Einstein, this is also true. He was a celebrity. We can set the baseline. He was a celebrity already a decade before he came to Caltech. So he was not an unknown feature. However, he also said that he never expected such a huge hullabaloo, such celebrity. It was a very specific moment in history, the early 1930s. It was a very specific moment in US history, German history, and California history that I think we have to address to understand why he was such a big success here, and Caltech made sure that they used him for their publicity. And they tried to protect him from the media. This is one of the tensions that we see as a historian. I try to give the facts, ma'am. This is something that the general public doesn't always appreciate, that we have these rational approaches to history.
As Ronald Reagan said, facts are stubborn things.
Right, but in our culture today, facts don't have the weight that they ought to be, and I have some anecdotes to show you that it was the same in 1931 when Einstein came to Caltech.
Well, why did he come to Caltech? I know Caltech had financial troubles at the time. Einstein had some political troubles emerging in Germany. As we know, Germany in 1931 was only a few years away from Hitler taking complete power and control of all the mechanics of government. And also there was the question of his science and his work and what he wanted to do here. Talk about those three aspects, would you?
Yes, so He came here, he was almost 52 years old. He considered himself an old man then, and this is the iconic image that we always have of the man with white hair and disheveled, which was actually photoshopped in American newspapers. They exaggerated.
What, to make it more disheveled?
More disheveled and more white. But let me give you his own words, and then we can see how this fits. He said, "The main purpose of my voyage is to allow me to take a direct part in the scientific life and the exchange and discussion with colleagues at Caltech. Perhaps I will also give some lectures." And then he praises the support for science and technology in the United States. Einstein had seen the United States 10 years earlier and was very impressed with what America had accomplished in science and technology. So this was the time that America overtakes Germany to a certain extent, not completely, in science, life sciences, physical sciences, technology, economic science, and so on. So he comes from what people at the time considered a position of strength, of an important civilization that has fostered research. Germany was the first country that had research laboratories for graduate students, the first country that had research seminars for scientists. That's where he comes from. And he sees, after knowing German postdocs and graduate students that were studying in Germany, that America is moving in this direction. And he thought that America is doing everything much better, that there is less hierarchy, more openness, openness to both experiment and theory, and so on. So he was truly enthusiastic about American science.
I think you sent me a letter that he wrote to his sister in 1931. There's neither envy nor stubbornness of any kind among the scholars. The people are internally democratic. So that must have impressed him too, as more collegial and collaborative.
This was the first time that he actually lived on a campus. Caltech was the only university with which he was ever associated. The Institute for Advanced Study, to which he goes 3 years later,
at Princeton,
is not an educational institution. It's not part of the university. So Einstein comes from being a professor in Germany, but not teaching too much and working with very few people closely. So he doesn't have a big lab, he doesn't have a big group, he has only one assistant at the time, one collaborator at the time. And he comes to America where he sees a much more lively, integrated, as you say, democratic, and American professors are not the stuffy, starchy professors of Germany. So this is what he means.
And when he's here at Caltech, how much of that kind of work, either alone or collaboratively, did he do? And how much did he get drawn away to cocktail parties and to, I mean, they showed him off like an Oscar. There are a lot of rich people who wintered in Pasadena back then, as the verb goes, in the big houses on Orange Grove.
Right.
And they must have used him as like the biggest fundraiser they had.
Yes, they used him as a trophy at dinner parties. They used him for fundraisers, and he describes that fundraiser at some point. I have a quotation somewhere. And they use him for their own gratification. These were wealthy people in Pasadena, wealthy people in Santa Barbara and Montecito, and Palm Springs. So this is his first trip. He gets taken around all these wealthy people, but at the same time, Pasadena is in the grip of the Great Depression. The number of businesses declined by half. I think you know a lot about the history of Los Angeles in those years of the Great Depression.
Very, very troubled times, and very difficult questions being asked about what do we spend our money on? Are we spending it on people? Why are we investing in science when it looks like science, in a way, has let us down, along with politics? So he, just by being there, was a comforting presence. Did he stimulate interest in science as well as interest in donating to Caltech?
I think he stimulated interest in science everywhere he went. And this is the interesting dichotomy between public life and private life. Einstein always tried to say that people should be interested in how a man like me thinks and why he thinks this way, not in what I do and what I suffer. But we now are mostly interested in what he does and what he suffers. So it's very difficult to have a quick cutting the man down to size in an hour of an interview. The complexity there shows itself in his letters, private letters, in his public statements. So he comes here also, he says, to assist in the economic crisis, to assist in continuing international reconciliation, in continuing economic exchanges, in not boycotting particular countries. The repercussions of the Versailles Treaty were still strongly felt around 1930. And the crisis...
This is the Germany where people had wheelbarrows full of currency in order to buy a loaf of bread because inflation was so bad.
The purchasing power was very low, and it wasn't just the inflation, it was unemployment, and banks had stopped functioning and exchanging currency, so there were many crises, financial, economic, and political.
And political, because when he left Germany, because he was here, as you noted, 3 times,
Yes.
The Germany he left, the academic Germany he left, was already beginning to feel the grip of fascism, of the sidelining, the marginalizing of Jews and intellectuals, sometimes very much the same. And he'd even had early run-ins in a classroom, I think you described, where he had students who were there who were not registered, which is to say they'd not been approved or paid tuition. And they tried to shut him down. And you can tell us what happened. And this seemed like an early foray into using his standing as a well-known person for political leverage.
So his fame came incrementally. He became famous after the 1919 solar eclipse expedition by Eddington that confirmed one of the predictions of general relativity. One other reason he came to Caltech, and he says it quite explicitly when he lands and when he talks to Caltech scientists, is that he is grateful to Caltech scientists for continuing this work of confirming the theory of general relativity. So he was not a public figure in 1919. He starts to become well known in 1920. He comes to the United States in 1921 with a Zionist delegation to raise funds for a Hebrew university in Mandatory Palestine. And during these 2-3 years, immediately after the eclipse expedition, he gets attacked quite virulently, and these issues with non-registered students annoy him very much. That's the first time that we see swastika pins being handed out at various meetings. So there is something that he calls the Anti-Relativity Company, LLC, and he handles it by objecting. He is then slapped down by the rector of the university, and he then says, I will teach a different class, not for credit, just for anybody who wants to attend. And he teaches briefly at a workers' union school.
Open to all.
Open to all. We must remember that German universities are public universities. What he sees here at Caltech is a private university. And he discusses this tension between public and private in one of his letters to his friends, the Lebachs, in which he says, everybody has to raise money for education, and general education is doing very poorly, basically referring to the fact that we have a system of private schools and the public schools in Pasadena are not doing very well, he says, and that there are huge income inequalities.
He wrote to his sister about that, and this is, of course, something we discuss to this very day, 90 years later, we're remarking on it.
Yes, nothing much has changed.
So with this,
unfortunately,
with this capital that he's accumulating, he's a secular Jew, he's not a practicing Jew, but he picks causes beyond science to stick up for. Sometimes it's anti-racist causes, sometimes it's standing up to anti-Semitism. How does he make his decision to enter this political part of his life, to use his standing as capital toward that?
I think, these are multi-causal events. Number one, in his second marriage, he marries his cousin, Elsa Einstein, with whom he has no children, who is also Jewish, and they live in Berlin, and they traverse the war. He traverses the war, World War I, within her family, and then he sees the flood of refugees from World War I that come from Eastern Europe, and sees the Jews who cannot go to university and cannot go to school and cannot get jobs because they are refugees. And that's when he's asked to help build a university that would admit Jewish students without a numerus clausus, without limitation. And these limitations were put in place not only in Germany, but also in the United States at the time, as you know, in the 1920s, President Lowell of Harvard and other, there were no immigration quotas yet, but they would be instituted in the 20s. So we're talking about a decade in which he and others experience anti-Semitism. But what is more important is not his Jewishness necessarily at this time, but the fact that he is a pacifist. And that's what he is for the next 15 years.
Like Millikan here at Caltech, yes?
Well, Millikan was in favor of international reconciliation and reestablishing ties with Germany.
That's a different thing.
That's a different thing, and in fact, Einstein comes on his second and third visit. He's supported by a German-American organization that encourages these kinds of reconciliatory steps that America took only very gradually. So Millikan is very much in favor of intellectual cooperation, and that's how the two of them meet. At the Committee for Intellectual Cooperation of what would become the United Nations, the League of Nations.
It's hard for us to understand from this perspective, knowing about Hitler and World War II, what pacifism really was in the 20s, which was a reaction to the most extraordinary slaughter in the history of humankind that we now call World War I, which was called the Great War then. So anybody who went through that would naturally, the first instinct would be to say, never again.
Never again. So this was both the hope and the tragedy of Democrats, liberals, communists, socialists between the two wars. The Weimar Republic that we talk about, it was really a very short-lived experiment, and it failed. So Einstein in Germany was not living in comfortable peace among liberal colleagues. He was living in a time where he was accused of being treasonous in his insistence that both Germany and France disarm, that the German Freikorps were hoarding weapons contrary to the Versailles Treaty. And there was a call for his assassination in their newspaper in 1921. You know that Walter Rathenau, the foreign secretary and the main negotiator in Paris of Versailles, was assassinated not far from the research institutes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, now Max Planck Society in Berlin, right in broad streetlight. And Einstein had to leave the city for a few weeks because there were personal threats. And the Jewish professors, liberal professors were not allowed, communists, pacifists were not allowed to teach. There were various cases, and there were other beatings and assassinations of intellectuals.
So this is
in
startling.
Germany. So it's a huge polarization throughout the 20s between the extreme right and the extreme left. You know, if it smells like polarization, it is. And we've been living through this too.
We are living through this now in a kind of different way, because then you're talking about the political points of view. I mean, I've interviewed Anthony Fauci several times, and the fact that this man who devoted his life to saving lives, who set up programs that save millions of lives, has had his own life threatened, has to have round-the-clock security for himself and his family because his science was threatened. In this case with Einstein, it was his politics, but now science and politics have become so conflated in some of the public mind that you can't extricate them anymore.
It was the same for Einstein. So the attacks on relativity were always either over or under a cloak of anti-Semitism. So the Einstein Papers Project that publishes all these beautiful volumes that you see up there on the mantelpiece is a laboratory. We have very many people working. I'm just one of 20 people. And when we worked on this period of the early 1920s and the attacks on Einstein and on relativity, we had a very difficult time disentangling what are legitimate scientific issues that that physicists had, because they didn't understand relativity, and the anti-Semitic and anti-liberal foundations of these attacks. Why do you think Einstein has persisted as a celebrity? Do you have a view?
I think because he's so easily identifiable, and you just put up a silhouette of him with the bushy mustache, the crazy hair, and the pipe, and people will know who that is, more than they know the science. But the science has endured, and in a sense, it has not been overthrown.
Right.
And I remember years ago when Pons and Fleischmann came up with their cold fusion, I was sent to cover them when they came to Los Angeles to present their paper. And of course, that didn't last very long. That was a flash in the pan. But people know Einstein in part because his work has endured. I mean, I'm sure you get letters all the time, I can prove Einstein wrong, and here's the proof, and it's written on scraggly paper. I used to get emails like that as well. But I think that's one of the reasons he has endured.
I think also because of his political stance. So, one example, we were talking about Millikan. Einstein, while he's on his first visit here, gets involved with the Tom Mooney, Warren Billings.
Tom Mooney was a wrongly accused and imprisoned labor leader. He was in prison for like 20 years. And I think he also ran for lieutenant governor of California at one point.
Yes. So the labor leaders, they organized, not Mooney, but labor movement organized a protest in 1916, mind you, in San Francisco, where a bomb exploded and there were casualties, and was incarcerated based on false evidence given by the police. And Einstein was asked to sign a petition for the pardon of Mooney. And when he gets back to Germany from Caltech, he writes a letter to Governor Rolfe, with whom we have a picture of Einstein standing outside the house that he had rented during his first visit here, not far on Oakland Street in California. And he writes to Rolf a personal letter asking Rolf to intervene in the proceedings, in the pardon proceedings. And he gets a very nasty letter back from Millikan. So here we are. These are questions that people always ask. Why did Einstein not come permanently to Caltech? Well, in the summer of 1931, after his first visit, there are negotiations between Einstein, Arthur Fleming, the chairman of the board of Caltech, and Millikan. And we don't have details about these negotiations. They happened in person and on phone calls and visits. And right at that moment, Millikan writes a letter to Einstein saying, "We have seen your petition to Governor Rolf in the newspaper. And the trustees, Robinson and Balch, are very disconcerted about what you've done." And this letter puts Einstein in his place. You're supposed to trust the lawyers, you're supposed to trust Governor Rolf, you're supposed to trust the Supreme Court of California that voted 1 to 6, not to grant any pardon. And we have to defer to the specialists, and we should not interfere in politics, which is strange coming from Millikan, who spent the entire 20s and 30s raising money and together with Hale creating the National Research Council. And he was very astute politically, and the people he mentions, Robinson in particular, had been an advisor to Hoover and was a very powerful man in the negotiations in Versailles, in Germany, in the 1920s. So Einstein, right at the time that they need to please Einstein, and he also needs to please them because the situation becomes unbearable in Germany.
Because he wants to,
and he needs an
come
exit,
here.
and he likes Caltech. He responds to this letter very politely but very firmly. And the bottom line is, I disagree with you. I think scientists should be involved in matters of social, political, conscientious participation in the life of the country and the community, and this is a morally and ethically unjust judgment. This is not a political issue, he says to Millikan. It's just morally and ethically wrong to put somebody to death because who has been unjustly accused.
That sounds like the end of the negotiations.
And it's very interesting, and I don't know, I have this, and he says that he, what does he say? That he thinks that he did the right thing. One should not rely on the references of the experts as one can deem them to be the least independent persons. The fact of having found fault with my letter, which was solely prompted by pure love of justice, strengthens my impression that not everything is as it should be. He doesn't say where, but basically that the justice system in America, and he did that in Germany too, for many, many causes. And we don't have time to cover
But this letter to his sister in 31, socialists, even merely suspected communist sympathizers, are simply jailed.
Yes.
So he had a sense of that system, but that's why he did not end up permanently at Caltech, was the split with Millikan?
I don't think so. I don't know. But this was a badly timed letter to Einstein, apostrophizing him for doing that.
What resonates today,
He
again,
comes back.
he does come back, but not permanently. What resonates today, 90 years later, is what I'm hearing in the Millikan rebuke is what people say today when a sports star makes a political statement or an actor. It's like, shut up and dribble is the literal phrase. Stick with what you know. Don't step out of your lane.
Right.
And so he pioneered in that in a way.
He pioneered in Germany. He was very unlike all his colleagues in the 1920s, speaking up for various causes. Einstein was not a communist. He was not a member of any political party. We would call him a democratic socialist today or something like that. But he put his name to many unpopular causes, that progressive causes. He was in favor of homosexuals not being jailed. He was in favor of women's abortion and against the prosecution of patients and doctors. He supported Charlie Chaplin during his divorce proceedings that where Chaplin was banned for a while because of
and ultimately refused re-entry to the United States. It's interesting because that goes back to that level of celebrity.
Yes.
Too, where, there's a famous image of Chaplin and Einstein, and Chaplin invited Einstein to the premiere of his film City Lights.
Yes.
So you see celebrity at this level. And I looked up newspaper clippings from that. And when they went to the premiere, this was in January of 1931, 25,000 people were outside the theater. Not all of them are there for Einstein, of course. But it was just extraordinary how big the surge, the attention to him was in that era. It said that people were jumping on the running boards of cars to get a look at people, that Millikan was there as well. And it was, Einstein, Chaplin, and this actress waved their hands as they passed inside the theater. So there's that level of fame, which it doesn't matter what you're famous for in a way. Right. It just conflates with all the other. And we discussed how he used his celebrity as kind of a political capital, but how did he handle it personally when he was here at Caltech? Because the phenomenon endures. That leather jacket that he wore, which I didn't know Levi's made leather jackets, but his leather jacket sold for more than $100,000. His pipe sold for tens of thousands of dollars. It's just the name resonates down the ages.
Yes,
and
it
so
does. So I understand that you have donated your library, including books by Allen Ginsberg, to Occidental, am I right?
My signed books, yes, all the people I've spoken with and encountered over the years.
So in 1965, both Ginsberg and Bob Dylan write about Einstein. And so Desolation Row, that longest song by Dylan of 11 minutes, crazy, phantasmagoric story of all these people that show up on Desolation Row. One stanza is devoted to Einstein.
Can you sing it? Or tell us the lyrics at least.
I don't know,
but now everybody will go listen to Desolation Row.
Einstein is showing up on Desolation Row as an old man walking around with a monk, sniffing the drain pipes. His memories in a trunk.
Of course.
And so he was a personality that made people think both about the new science, and this is important, we have to keep that in mind. He came to Caltech to do science. He went to Mount Wilson. He went to many, many seminars. He engaged in the discussions after the seminars. He stayed overnight at Mount Wilson.
I sat in his chair at Mount Wilson. So his rump and my rump shared the same space, divided by time, which we know is inconsequential.
Yes. So yes, he was a celebrity, and of course the trip to California turned him into a celebrity. How do you explain 80,000 people showing up at City Hall when he's given the so-called keys to Los Angeles? But he does smaller things too. So in his diary, he writes, today, I spent the evening with the Robinsons. Yeah. And then, to the dismay of everybody, I went to the black church in Pasadena, where I listened to spiritual songs, to memorialize Julius Rosenwald, who had given millions and millions for the education of African American children in the United States. And Rosenwald had died on the 6th of January, and a day later or something, there is this meeting at the Black Methodist Church in Pasadena. And he writes in his diary, "To the displeasure of the higher-ups, I went."
Because everything he did would have gotten attention then.
Yes, and because maybe
was-
they didn't want him to go to an African-American church in Pasadena, which was not a segregated city, but a
sunset,
separate.
sundown, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Did this kind of opposition and pushback make him more determined than ever to support and to be seen supporting things?
I think so. I think the race issue in America was a big problem for him. He identified with it. He thought it's a major problem. When he moved to Princeton in 1933, he continued. He went to Howard University. He supported black intellectuals, black singers, and so on. So yes.
You know, what's surprising as I'm hearing you talk is how canny he was about public relations at a time when we don't think of public relations, or his image is that of the abstract big thinker who would not lower himself to some of these things. But he seems to be pretty savvy about how he uses what he knows to be his own image.
Well, he is asked by progressives to support them and to write in progressive magazines here and abroad. So he's very consistent. One of the big things we've discovered over the years at the Einstein Papers Project is that Einstein wrote much more than we knew. So we had something like 300, we thought there were some 200 to 300 written items for publication by Einstein. We've already discovered twice as many. And many of these things appear in daily newspapers, in cultural magazines, and in scientific journals. He was prolific throughout his career, from his 40s to the end of his life. He was a very hard worker, even though at times he was quite ill. So if one takes all of his public activity, the big picture, he never gave up on anything. So he continued to speak against racism, in favor of reconciliation, pacifism, and of course, here again, the times matter. He's a pacifist until 1939. And in 1939, when war breaks out in Europe, he's not a pacifist anymore, and the pacifists are very upset, in particular in the United States, because America is not yet at war. By 1941, people are not attacking him anymore as not being a pacifist. So he changes his mind. The same thing about Israel. So as long as Palestine is under British mandate, Einstein is not in favor of a Jewish nation state. He wants an Arab Jewish nation state. And so he's very active in trying to bring about cooperation and collaboration among Jewish and Arab leaders. And of course he fails, and he is chastised for this position as being an idealist, as being naive. But by 1948, after we have heard about what happened during the Holocaust, he changes his mind and is in favor of the establishment of a state in Israel. But that's the decolonization everywhere at that time.
I want to ask about, you're talking about him changing his mind, and I'm wondering if attitudes toward science today, as we see them being skeptical, even hostile, is this part of the perception? People don't understand the scientific process, that it is not ever actually really the answer, that it's always subject to flux and subject to scrutiny. And here's Einstein, who changed his mind when he was confronted with, facts and evidence as the evidence itself changed. Is it just, you think, the origins of this that people don't understand? They want answers. They want absolute answers. If they have one report one week that coffee's bad for you, and next week there's another report saying coffee's good for you, they say, oh, well, science, what do you expect?
Right. So he was asked about these things a lot, and he tried to emphasize that science changes, and he, in his so-called, in his writings about science, in his popular writings, in his speeches, he always emphasized that science takes a very long time. It's a gradual process. It changes. And if it were not to change, it would not be science. It is at the foundation of scientific practice,
is, right?
Right, to overcome difficulties and come with some new science as a result. And that's what he did. Einstein was a revolutionary, a rebel. That's why he writes to Millikan that, no, you have to query authority. And he said this to his students, and he said this in many articles. I don't think that fundamentally the popular image of science has changed that much. We get enthusiastic for the first moon landing, and then we don't pay as much attention to Artemis. We love that there is a new theory of space and time in 1920 with Einstein. And then when gravitational waves get confirmed 100 years later, it's mostly the scientists who are excited. So, as Einstein says, it's not a good idea to think about the public too much. It's painful when it has to do with life and death issues, and I take this very seriously. The anti-vax movement is dangerous. It's dangerous to all of us. And why people prefer snake oil to Fauci is complicated, but it happens everywhere, not just in the United States.
A couple of things I wanted to be sure to get to before we get to the audience questions is that here's a scientist who stepped out of his lane and had a lot of things to say about the state of the world and about the kind of moral concepts that we live with. But there are things that he is often quoted as saying which he didn't say. Right. So I think we can do a minute of debunking here.
With pleasure.
About, the old, I think God doesn't play dice with the universe, things like that.
That's true.
That one's true? Okay,
yes.
Everybody, score that one for Einstein and take it to Vegas. But what he didn't say was what?
I don't
What is that repeating? Oh, the one about repeating something again and again and expecting different results
is not.
It's insanity.
Absolutely,
okay.
Yes. Not Einstein.
How did these things get attached to him, do you think?
I don't know. There is this underground quotation culture that proliferates.
But it sounds so credible. If Einstein said it, it has to be real.
It has to be true, yes. And Einstein is credited with inventing double accounting and all sorts of things that he didn't say. There is a wonderful little book, The Quotable Einstein, by Alice Calaprice, in which she tries to carefully separate the true, the maybe true, and the not true. in this collection.
I think he and Mark Twain, because Mark Twain was
Yes.
so witty and Einstein is so smart, people naturally would hook onto one or the other of them,
Right.
something that they would really like to be able to look like they're smart themselves and say, well, Einstein said this or Mark Twain said that. So there's a whole need to debunk some of that, which is different from debunking science by scientists and debunking science by people who don't know what they're talking about.
Right, and this is difficult, and it may be a peculiarly American problem that some people with credentials, or at least with a degree in medicine or physiology or something, become leaders in our political decisions as to vaccines, as to diet.
TikTok influencers.
Well, we have people now in positions, government positions, and to me, it's really, it's one thing I cannot understand is why they would work so much against the facts.
Well, there was one guy who's, I think, in the administration who said he was teleported to a Waffle House. So this is what we're up against, I think.
Right.
So did it happen to Einstein, as it often happens,
Yes.
as we see in the celebrity cycle here,
Yes.
that you raise up a figure and then you tear him down? Now, it's one thing to be disproven in the scientific community or challenged. Another thing in that larger world of celebrity where we saw, for example, Chaplin's fall.
Right. He was attacked. Personally, he received many letters that attacked his political positions on racism in this country. He got letters that were very unpleasant to read for speaking out for the African American
You have those letters
community.
here, I'm sure.
Yes, we do. And we'll publish them. We published them. He was raised and then shown to have feet of clay. And that's an exercise that journalists in particular like to engage with.
But through human history, I mean, you read The Golden Bough and you raise up an
Yes.
idol for a year and then you cut his heart out, and here we go.
Right. One misconception that sort of hangs over him, and did so in Time magazine repeatedly, is that he was responsible for the atomic bomb. That is a big ethical, moral question, because he wrote a letter before the war started, trying to explain to FDR that the Germans are conquering areas that contain uranium that could be used to produce nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Einstein himself officially was never involved with the Manhattan Project.
In fact, they wouldn't let him anywhere near it.
Exactly. He did not have a security clearance. He was not given a security clearance. These things show up in movies like Oppenheimer, where the interactions with Einstein are completely distorted. So this is another example of what the media can and do. But that doesn't mean that Einstein wasn't in favor of the war effort. On the contrary, he was very much supportive of US troops and US scientists. And we have a letter from Einstein asking one of the very important Caltech scientists, von Karman, who was leading the jet fuel development at Caltech, at Galsit, at the Guggenheim laboratories. Caltech was the pioneer of liquid fuel rockets and missiles, and Caltech was a military powerhouse during World War II. I don't know that many people know about this. It was the precursor of the local aviation industry. And Einstein
defense industry as
writes him a private note that is handed to de Karman, not in the mail. And he writes to de Karman saying, I know you must be very busy. I'm sorry to trouble you. I know you're doing very important work that will help defeat the terrible Germans. He doesn't use that word. When will it happen? I think it's soon, right? So Einstein wasn't as naive about what was happening in the scientific military complex as he sometimes presented.
Oh, no, so I want to get to some of our questions,
Yes,
but if you
please.
want to wrap up that thought.
No, please.
So there's a place on your screen, as you will see, that you can ask some questions, and questions are already coming in a lot from Caltech alums, and we're happy to hear that. So let's see. Here's a question from Mark S., who got his BS here in '93. If Einstein were alive today, what would he be doing about the current political environment, or would he be too intimidated to say anything?
What do you think?
I think that there's a critical mass of criticism, and that he probably would have led it and been asked to lead it.
I agree.
And credibly do so.
And he did so, with a peril maybe to his reputation. He spoke up during the McCarthy era. He defended a physics teacher who was accused of communism. We have to remember that communism was not illegal in the United States at the time, that communists or communist-affiliated or followers like Oppenheimer were prosecuted or interrogated without any legal basis. These were witch hunts, and Einstein spoke up, and I think he would speak up today too.
Why was he spared the witch hunts?
Because by that time he was a nobody. He was a retired member of the Institute for Advanced Study. He had no students, he had no grants, he had no money.
But he was still, in the long sense, a somebody.
He was a somebody, and they did not dare to bring him in front of HUAC.
So that his celebrity in a way protected him.
Yes, and also he had no influence on anything. He wasn't leading major national laboratories. He wasn't a member of the Atomic Energy Commission. On the contrary, what Einstein starts with his colleagues is the so-called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the Committee for Civilian Control of Atomic Weapons. Mm-hmm. And that was another, people said, he's an idealist. He shouldn't be doing this. The atomic weapons, we need them, and there's the Cold War, and the Russians are far behind, says Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer was wrong. The Russians were not far behind. And Einstein wants a world government, and people thought he's out of his mind. He's naive, he's childish. So this is where this myth comes from too, that he had aspirations beyond what most people considered realistic. He was not a politician.
He was a dreamer, both then scientifically and politically.
He was a dreamer, and this is where criticism of Einstein shows up, that he wasn't a realist and he wasn't.
But maybe that saved him in the long run.
But in his private correspondence, he says, I'm doing all these things in the full knowledge that these are ideals, that these are dreams. I know it's not going to happen.
But they never get to that part in the footnotes.
Exactly.
Here we have, let's see, we have Dr. Suman Chakrabarti wants to know, did Einstein's actions at Caltech connect to the exodus of von Braun, von Karman, and other German scientists to the USA after World War II?
All right, let's take it by the salami method, one slice at a time. Einstein decides to leave Germany basically already in 1931, and his last visit to Caltech is 1932-33, and he never goes back to Europe. There were some people, like de Karman, who came earlier. De Karman was, so these are people who see where things are going, and de Karman already came in 29, 30 to Caltech. There are writers, poets, and so on who emigrate early before socialists, communists, gay people, gypsies, and Jews get put into the first concentration camps in Germany. So between 1933 and 1938, there is a huge exodus, and Einstein becomes fundamentally a visa office for many people. Many people beg him to help them find jobs in the United States, not necessarily academic jobs, and he tries that very hard. And we have a lot of letters that he writes to Caltech scientists asking them to find a position for a young German.
Did it work for the most part?
It didn't. But there are interesting nuances in this. Von Neumann goes to the Institute. I just want to tell Mr. Chakrabarty that von Braun was not a refugee to the United States.
He was a get. He was a big get.
He came to this country after the war, basically as a U.S.
Was he one of the Pinamundi scientists who, and we got divvied up between the Soviets, got this guy, we got that guy?
Right. He's the one, as Tom Lehrer says, where the rockets go up and you don't know where they come down. So he's the man who started us on the Apollo missions. He's the man who started the United States space program. But he was not a refugee. He came to the United States to serve the United States.
After the war.
After the war, he was responsible for the V-2 rockets and the Blitz.
I guess all was forgiven if you had his credentials. So, Lawrence, who let me see. Where are we? Yes. Gosh, I'm so sorry. I lost the question I was looking for. Here we go. Lawrence, class of 64, Lawrence Oliver. What was Einstein's impact outside of theoretical physics when he was here? Did he influence undergrads at Caltech?
That's a nice question. So Caltech was very small at the time. The undergraduate population was around 400. There were no dormitories yet, so the first house at Caltech, student house, was opened the year that Einstein came in 1931. I think he had great influence on young people in Southern California. He spoke to the Caltech undergraduates. He spoke at the inauguration of the Pasadena City College Observatory. PCC at that time was Pasadena Junior College, and 8,000 people came to see him speak, encourage young people to pursue their dreams, to do what they like to do, to be enthusiastic about science as well.
That sounds like a standard commencement speech, except
it was a standard
he
commencement speech. He delivered it. We have very nice pictures. But what's interesting is that Pasadena Junior College had been melded. So you had the Pasadena High School, grades 11, 12, and what we now call junior college, grades 13 and 14. And their population had risen to, I think, 4,000 students because of the Depression.
Of course.
Students could not afford to go full-time to university. And so this PCC helped low-income students. And the numbers, because there was unemployment, the number of students swelled. So Caltech has retained this very elite enrollment. It's a very tough school to get into, a 3% acceptance rate. And it was a very small school and has remained a very small school. And he interacted with students quite a bit, but he did not teach classes at Caltech. He was a visiting scientist. So he interacted mostly with the more advanced graduate students, postdocs, and we had much fewer graduate students and postdocs than we do today.
And there wasn't even a formal mechanism. It would have been
No.
incidental or casual.
Incidental, casual, yes.
Let's see. We have Sotirios Katsoulis, master's in 23. Is there a case where an accepted interpretation of Einstein's thinking was wrong once you read the primary sources in sequence? I think that's a question a lot of people would like to know.
So I don't quite understand whether, was Einstein wrong or were we wrong in
Is there a
previous...
case where an accepted interpretation of Einstein's thinking was wrong once you read the primary sources in sequence? So misapprehensions, I suppose, of his work, misinterpretations.
Misinterpretations? No, I don't know whether misinterpretations of the work, but new understanding of the work. And where I think my colleagues have made over the years the most important discoveries is that everything, as Einstein says, Einstein was a realist and a determinist. Everything has a reason and a cause, and we have discovered the causes of the development of his thinking, the mechanisms. Things didn't happen overnight. These questions preoccupied him for a very long time. What's interesting is that Einstein agreed to a series of interviews when he was about 40 by a journalist, Moskovsky, who was extremely perceptive and talked about his path to his scientific thought and way of thinking. He tried to explain his work. It's, as you said, very difficult work. So, yes, textbooks teach us that Einstein came up with the special theory of relativity because Albert Michelson carried out experiments when Einstein was but a few years old, showing that there is no ether. So this was a negative experiment that was extremely important, trying to see whether there is a substance out there that pervades both terrestrial and cosmic space that would influence the speed of light. And so Michelson carried out these measurements of the speed of light, and some of them were carried out here at Mount Wilson. So this was a project that stretched for over half a century. And this is where people tried to disprove Einstein's theory of relativity with these measurements.
There we go back to the tearing down of the idol.
Well, no,
again.
they really didn't like her. They thought
These aren't amateurs.
that Michelson was wrong and that other experiments were wrong. So these experiments were carried out by Caltech scientists in the mid-20s again, and they disproved any doubts about the constancy of the speed of light, regardless of the medium through which light travels. So no, Einstein did not come up with the special theory of relativity because of these experimental. So this is a big topic where I think we've made a lot of contributions. And he himself, when he comes to Caltech, talks about this. He sees himself as being part of a long chain of scientists, both experimentalists and theoreticians, where things are confirmed or disconfirmed. Einstein makes mistakes and corrects himself. He's one of the very few scientists I know who, if they're told you've made an error in your calculations, will publish a correction. And this is very pertinent.
That says a lot about him and other scientists.
Yes. So he always says, yep, after all, you're right, I made a mistake.
So he was a self-correcting mechanism. So, I love this question. Did Einstein meet Feynman? And if he did, what did they talk about?
I don't think Einstein met Feynman, but I don't know for sure.
But it would be quite a conversation.
He's not, there is no correspondence with Feynman.
Tom Stoppard could make a great play out of that, I think. So, Let's see, this is from Bob Calloway, class of 60, regarding Einstein's 39 letter to Roosevelt expressing concerns about the atomic bomb. What was the president's reaction? What was Einstein's reaction? Or what was FDR's
Roosevelt.
reaction?
Total silence. Nothing happens.
No response,
No
nothing?
response whatsoever.
No thank you for your letter, here's
No.
an enclosed autograph picture?
No, nothing. It is only, so eventually, after about 6 months, FDR appoints a committee to investigate the properties of fissionable material, and he sets it up with the Navy and so on. And that committee does what it does, but really the atomic project, the Manhattan Project, only starts after Pearl Harbor.
Oh.
Yes.
This is...
It's sunk.
It's sunk,
Yeah.
his letter, without a trace, pretty much. Adam Craig, class of '07, what are some of Einstein's least known interests? Has the Einstein Papers Project revealed even more obscure investigations?
This is a very good question. Thank you. Einstein had many other scientific interests. When he says that curiosity is the most important thing, and here we come back to anti-vaccine, yes? Einstein was curious about things outside his narrow area of interest. He was actually curious about advances in cancer therapy. He had friends who were doctors who asked to talk to him about these things. If we remember that as a student, he was immensely interested in thermodynamics and physical chemistry and wanted to be, he applied for one job to be an assistant to the greatest physical chemist alive at the time in Germany, Wilhelm Ostwald. We will see that he was interested in the properties of metals, of gases, of carbon fibers and lamp bulbs. He had 30 patents to his name. One of them was a refrigerator. Others were navigational compasses for ships. He collaborated with an industrialist to build these things. He even testified as an expert witness in patent litigation to earn additional money.
So he made money
as
on his
professor.
patents.
No, he didn't make money off his patents. Almost nothing was built. People knew that he was curious. He was interested in radio and television and telephony. Because his son became an engineer, he was interested in the path of rivers and did some calculations in diffusion theories. He had many, many interests, and our volumes show that. He was interested in music. He was an amateur musician. And so he was consulted about the properties of violins, you know, the acoustical, what makes a good violin.
And he had some good violins.
He had some good violins, and he called them all Lina. All his violins were Lina from violine, violina. He liked sailing. He had a boat for a very short time, for 2 years, that was confiscated by the Nazis immediately in 1933, a boat that was given to him for his 50th birthday as a gift in 1929. And then he had a little boat in Princeton, which he called Tinef, which means a useless guy, but he couldn't swim. So there are many details, many interests. You may be interested to know that he wasn't a vegetarian, but he expressed support for the vegetarian diet.
I'm happy to hear that. I'll be making a T-shirt to that effect.
He was asked his opinion on many, many things. And for example, while here at Caltech, an engineer from Colorado, I think, writes to him about magnetism and the Earth's magnetism. And the Earth's magnetism was a problem that interested Einstein for 40 years. And it's a very important problem that he discussed here with scientists. And so letters coming in on many topics, he took them very seriously.
And answered them,
He
evidently.
answered almost every letter, yes.
Here's a question, perhaps on that point of a variety of interests. David Anderson, whether you can connect Einstein at Caltech to Kip Thorne's and Barry Barish's direct demonstration of gravity waves through the interim work of other Caltech faculty.
Well, this is a big story. There is a book published called Einstein Was Right, in which we have contributions by Barry Barish and Kip Thorne. We had a conference shortly after the discovery of gravitational waves and the public announcement. It is a very strong tradition to investigate relativity, gravitational waves, but also the astronomical and astrophysical consequences. So what we haven't talked about at all is how important the work of people at Mount Wilson was for convincing Einstein to come here. He expresses his gratitude to them. So Caltech's Physics, Mathematics, and Astronomy division is one of the oldest. It's what Millikan wanted. And he brought the best people that he could as visiting scientists. So there is a direct line. Now, Einstein first predicted that there would be gravitational waves 100 years before Barry Barish, Kip Thorne, and LIGO proved the existence of gravitational holes produced by gravitational waves by two colliding black holes. But the division of the physicists and the astronomers here have been interested in these topics. Now, relativity in and of itself is a different story. It had ups and downs. Einstein's work was not investigated by physicists for 100 years. He himself said gravitational waves are probably way too weak to be detected. He worked on several models. Are there transversal waves? Are there vertical waves? Which ones could be detected? Do they carry energy? And so it has taken more or less 50 years since the experiments of Joe Weber, who first tried to detect gravitational waves, to 2015-16 with Kip Thorne and Barry Barish, to create these most remarkable instruments that are part of LIGO. And these instruments are not only fantastic for what they have done, but for what they promise to do in the future. We are living in the most fantastic era for all aspects of astronomy. This is the greatest event of the 21st century. Yes.
Here's a Caltech-specific question. I think we'll have to make that our last question before we wrap up, because, of course, time is in charge of all of this.
Even if it's relative.
Even if it's relative. Jim Detterman, class of '84, is there any truth to the story of a tunnel from Caltech to the Cheese Right Studios building that Einstein used to maintain his privacy? Your own private tunnel, that's better than your own private island.
There is a story that everybody on Green Street tells visitors, that there was a tunnel between Caltech and Green Street during the war, and that Einstein worked at Caltech during the war, both of which are completely untrue.
Okay.
So there are at Caltech tunnels. There are the wind tunnels in the Guggenheim Laboratory, and then there are the steam tunnels under Caltech. And the steam tunnels are what Caltech undergraduates love to do and explore and are not supposed to do, to go through the steam tunnels. But Einstein did not walk through a tunnel at Caltech.
We do have to wrap it up, and before we do, the most famous picture of Einstein is him sticking out his tongue. So you can give us 15 seconds on what that was about.
That happened on his 72nd birthday in Princeton. He gave out an award, the first so-called Einstein Award for science that evening, and then there was a dinner, and he didn't want to have his picture taken, and he stuck his tongue out to Arthur Sassy, the photographer.
Classic Einstein. Diana, thank you so much. I love this conversation. I think everyone
I'm very grateful for you for visiting us at Caltech. You have written about Caltech before. You have a podcast about pollution that's
thank you.
Pertains to Caltech.
Yes, it does. And thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we want to let you know that you can listen again or for the first time to this conversation shared with you who subscribe to this in coming days. And if you want to go deeper, the Einstein Papers Project is right here at your favorite old campus, Caltech. I'm Pat Morrison. This is Diana Kormos-Buchwald. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.